Chapter 7.
The sun was just rising out of the Atlantic when the yacht chugged away from the dock. A half-hour later the exploring party had circled Point Key and anchored off the reef, directly above the cave. "I'll stand watch aboard," Dr. Shaw said. The other four donned the tight-fitting black rubber suits, and checked each other's gear carefully. Stan fastened a reel of nylon cord to his belt and tied its leading end to the ship's rail. This was their signal line, their only means of communication with the boat. "If we give you the emergency signal," Stan McAllister said, "notify the Coast Guard. They'll send rescue divers down after us. I've told them that we're working in this area. They can be over here in a few minutes." McAllister eased his way over the guardrail and dropped into the water. The others followed. With a final wave to the doctor, they started down. Gary led the way, followed by Jordan and Laurie. Stan took last position, the nylon line unreeling behind him as he sank into the water. In a few minutes they were in the cave. Stan left 2 extra air tanks by the opening to the tunnel and they silently entered the gaping hole. As before, Gary felt a moment of panic when he found himself enclosed in the smooth tunnel. But this time, each diver had a powerful underwater light fastened to his head. And each carried extra equipment, knives, small pickaxes, shark billies to ward off any possibly hostile fish, and plastic specimen bags. Stan had 3 airtight miniature signal transmitters. He planned to leave them along the way for surface locating. In addition, Jordan had brought an 8mm movie camera in a special airtight housing. If he had the opportunity, he planned to use it. Glancing at his depth gauge, Gary saw they had already reached 100 feet and were near the branching passageways. The depth increased to 110 feet, then slowly decreased. At 70 feet he found himself by the twin tunnels, where the others joined him. Now Stan took the lead as they entered the unexplored opening. The nylon line was transferred to Jordan, who became the anchor man. In the close confines of the tunnel, the sounds of their air bubbles leaving the regulators made high-pitched ponging sounds and Gary watched them pour around him from Stan's exhaust. The narrow passageway was flooded with soft pink light from their sealed beam torches. It gave them an eerie sensation, almost like floating in outer space. The tunnel started downward again. If it continued at this angle, Gary knew they would have to shorten their dive considerably. It would be necessary to decompress at several different levels. They had therefore only another hour at most. 120 feet. And then, quite suddenly, the passage widened and they entered a huge undersea cavern. The rocky walls widened on all sides and he could just make out the roof some 30 feet above him. They gathered around in a circle, while Stan debated what to do. He finally signaled them to follow in single file while he led them around the edges of the strange new world. Few signs of life existed in the cave. A pair of shrimp crawled along a rock, and some tiny fish scuttled past in blurs of lavender color. It was Laurie who made the discovery. She had moved to one side of the others, and suddenly waved her arms in a signal. They swam over to her. Nothing had prepared them for what they saw. A tall, perfectly formed structure stood at one end of the huge cavern. Eons of time had failed to disguise its graceful outlines with more than a thin coating of organic silt. It was a building. There could be no doubt about it. The construction was far too perfect to have been the result of accidental shaping. It was made of crystal and stood at least 20 feet in height. A doorway led to its interior. The crystal walls became soft green when Stan brushed off the silt with his hand. Cautiously he entered the doorway, probing its interior with his light. They followed him inside. The chamber measured 40 feet in length and width, with its ceiling a good 20 feet overhead. And in its center was a coffin-shaped box of glassy red hue. They stood around it in awe. Gary ran his fingers over its sides. He could not find a seam anywhere. It seemed to be a solid cube of crystal. Dimly he made out a vague form within, but it was impossible to determine what it might be, for the ruby-red sides were opaque. No other object was in the building, only the glass box on the polished crystal floor. Jordan tried in vain to move it. Stan tapped him on the shoulder and shook his head. He signaled for Jordan to watch him. A moment later, a great cloud of bubbles surrounded Stan's head as he pushed against the object with his shoulder. Jordan recalled the diver's earlier instructions: if you want to exert force underwater, you must exhale to make your body heavier than the surrounding water. Jordan nodded and, along with the others, shoved against the box. It seemed to move a fraction of an inch. Then it was not fastened to the floor. Good. But now Stan was motioning again. He pointed to his wristwatch, then pointed upward. Time was running out. They would have to return to the surface. Reluctantly, Jordan turned away. Lori had been peering closely into the crystal cube, her face close against its side. Motioning excitedly to Jordan, she tapped his camera and silently told him to use it. He swam over, adjusted the camera settings and pressed it against the glass-like box. Lori shook her head and indicated a small circle on the cube where, for some reason, there was a 2-inch area that was colorless and semi-transparent. It resembled a glass plug or peephole. Jordan moved the camera lens to this spot and started the camera in operation. He ran it for several seconds, until Stan grabbed him by the shoulder and angrily signaled for him to start back up. They retraced their way through the cavern to the tunnel. The journey back was slow and deliberate. Every so often, Stan would make them halt and tread water for several minutes before continuing upward. As an ex-naval diver, Stan knew the various decompression tables and times by heart. At last they broke through the surface and were hauled aboard the yacht by Dr. Shaw. Jordan looked at his chronometer. Not quite 8 o'clock. It seemed a lifetime since they had submerged, but it was simply time for breakfast. "Have a nice trip?" asked the doctor jovially. "Oh, Doc, you'll never believe what we have to tell you," Lori gasped, pulling off her headpiece. "Save it until we have something to eat," he answered. The aroma of frying bacon drifted up from the galley. At breakfast Stan told the doctor of their discovery. The older man seemed stunned by the findings. A man-made building in a subterranean cavern below the ocean? A coffin? It sounds incredible. The doctor slowly shook his head. Incredible. "I'll swear there was a body inside that box," Lori insisted. "I took some pictures of it, Doc," Jordan added, holding up the camera. He fumbled with the watertight housing and pulled it open. "I can hardly wait to get this roll processed. Sure hope I have the exposure set right." Dr. Shaw suddenly recalled the message he had just received. "The Coast Guard reports that heavy seas are forming. We'll have to put about and return to shore. Another storm is in the making." "Gosh, that's the third in the past few days," Gary wailed in disappointment. "Never mind," Dr. Shaw replied, "we'll have a chance to rush Jurdy's film through the lab at the university. I'd like to see this discovery of yours for myself."